The emergency satellite phone crackled to life at 3:47 a.m., shattering the silence of the Olympic Peninsula Research Station. Dr. Maya Chen fumbled for the device in the darkness, her breath forming small clouds in the unheated cabin. October nights in Washington's temperate rainforest carried a bone-deep chill that no amount of layered fleece could fully dispel. Dr. Chen. The voice belonged to Marcus Webb, the grad student she'd stationed at the Northern Monitoring Site. His words came fast, unsteady. "You need to see this. The thermal drone. Something triggered the motion sensors. Grid 17, subsector C." Maya sat upright, instantly alert. Grid 17 covered a remote valley system 12 miles northwest, an area so dense with Sitka spruce and western hemlock that even experienced hikers avoided it. Bear activity? That's what I thought at first. Marcus paused, and Maya heard him draw a sharp breath. But the thermal signature is wrong. The gate analysis software keeps throwing errors, and there's infrastructure. Dr. Chen, there are structures down there. Her pulse quickened. For 18 months, their team had been conducting wildlife surveys in Olympic National Park, deploying sophisticated sensor networks to track endangered species movements. The drone system used cutting-edge thermal imaging combined with AI-driven behavioral analysis, technology originally developed for military applications, now repurposed for conservation biology. "I'm sending you the feed now," Marcus continued, "but I wanted to warn you first. This isn't like anything in our reference database." Maya's laptop screen illuminated, casting blue light across her weathered field notes. The thermal footage loaded in segments, each frame tagged with precise GPS coordinates and environmental metadata. What she saw made her forget the cold entirely. The drone's downward-looking camera had captured multiple large bipedal forms moving through the forest canopy at ground level. The thermal signatures registered body temperatures consistent with large mammals, around 98 to 100 degrees Fahrenheit, but the morphology was wrong for any known species in the region. These weren't bears on hind legs. The stride pattern showed continuous bipedal locomotion with arm swing mechanics that suggested habitual upright posture. But it was the structures that arrested her attention completely. Partially concealed by the dense understory, the thermal imaging revealed geometric anomalies, circular depressions approximately 8 to 12 feet in diameter, arranged in a deliberate cluster. The temperature differential suggested these were semi-subterranean dwellings, their surfaces warmer than the surrounding soil by several degrees. Ventilation shafts, perhaps, or the residual heat from occupation. "Grid 17 is inside the park boundary," Maya said carefully, her scientific training warring with the impossible implications of what she was seeing. "No human habitation is permitted there, no roads, no trails maintained in that sector for 30 years. "I know." Marcus's voice dropped. "That's why I called you directly, before logging it officially." Maya understood the subtext immediately. Once this entered their formal data stream, it would be flagged, reviewed, and quite possibly confiscated under a dozen different federal protocols. The Park Service, the Forest Service, potentially Homeland Security. Everyone would want answers they couldn't provide. She made her decision in seconds. "Pack the portable analysis kit. Meet me at the trailhead in 40 minutes. And Marcus, don't mention this to anyone else yet, not until we know what we're dealing with." "Copy that." The line went dead. Maya dressed rapidly, pulling on moisture-wicking layers and her field vest with practiced efficiency. Her mind raced through protocols and possibilities, each more improbable than the last. Black market pot farm? Unlikely this deep in protected wilderness. Undocumented human settlement? The thermal signatures were too large, too consistent with non-human morphology. She grabbed her emergency medical kit from habit. In remote field research, you prepared for everything from broken bones to hypothermia. The kit included broad-spectrum antibiotics, trauma supplies, and enough equipment to stabilize a critically injured person until helicopter extraction could arrive. 20 minutes later, Her battered Land Cruiser bounced along the deteriorating fire road that served as the only vehicular access to the northern monitoring sites. Rain began to fall, the characteristic Pacific Northwest drizzle that could persist for days. Her headlights caught the reflective eyes of a black-tailed deer, frozen momentarily before bounding into the Salal understory. Marcus waited at the trailhead, a lean figure in rain gear, with two large backpacks at his feet. At 26, he was completing his doctoral research on carnivore ecology, specifically the recolonization patterns of wolves returning to the Olympic Peninsula. His technical skills with remote sensing equipment had made him invaluable to their research program. "The drone's still transmitting," he said without preamble, handing her a ruggedized tablet. "I programmed it to hold position at 200 feet, passive monitoring mode only. No lights, minimal noise signature." Maya studied the live feed as they shouldered their packs and started up the trail. The beings, she struggled for appropriate terminology, had moved deeper into the valley system, but the thermal signatures remained clear. 7 distinct individuals, ranging in size from what appeared to be adolescent to fully mature adult specimens. The trail quickly deteriorated into a barely discernible game path. They navigated by headlamp and GPS, moving carefully through terrain thick with sword ferns and devil's club, the latter's thorny stems capable of inflicting painful wounds. The forest here was primordial, some of the trees exceeding 6 feet in diameter and rising 200 feet into the darkness above. After 90 minutes of steady climbing, Marcus held up a hand. "Half a mile out. We should cut lights and proceed on night vision from here." They switched their headlamps to dim red LEDs, less likely to disturb wildlife or be visible from distance. Maya's scientific training emphasized observation protocols. Never interfere, never habituate wild animals to human presence. But what were the protocols for a discovery that shouldn't exist? The structures appeared first as darker shadows against the forest floor, barely visible in the pre-dawn gloom. Maya dropped to a crouch, motioning Marcus to do the same. They were positioned on a slight ridge, overlooking a natural amphitheater, a bowl-shaped depression approximately 100 meters across. Below them, the thermal imaging had revealed truth. 5 semi-subterranean dwellings were arranged in a rough semicircle, their entrances facing a central common area. The construction was sophisticated. Not primitive lean-tos, but carefully engineered structures using earth berms, living tree roots, and what appeared to be woven branches as support framework. Moss and ferns covered the exterior surfaces, providing both insulation and camouflage that would render them virtually invisible to aerial surveillance during growing season. "My God," Marcus breathed. This is engineered architecture." Maya nodded slowly, documenting everything with her camera's low-light capability. The site showed clear evidence of long-term occupation, well-worn paths between the dwellings, a central fire pit with heat-fractured river rocks, and carefully maintained ventilation systems that would allow smoke to disperse gradually rather than creating visible plumes. Movement caught her eye. One of the structure's entranceways darkened, and a figure emerged. The being stood easily 7 feet tall, powerfully built, with body proportions that fell somewhere between human and great ape. Its body was covered in dark, reddish-brown hair, longer on the shoulders and arms, shorter on the torso. The face, barely visible in the dim light, showed a pronounced brow ridge but a flatter profile than any known ape species. When it turned its head, scanning the area with obvious alertness, Maya's breath caught. The cranium was large, rounded, with clear expansion of the frontal regions, associated with higher cognitive function. This was no relict ape, no evolutionary dead end that somehow survived extinction. The being moved with purposeful intelligence, checking the central area before making a low, modulated vocalization, not a roar or howl, but something closer to speech, with tonal variation that suggested meaning. 3 more emerged from adjacent dwellings, 2 adults, and what appeared to be a juvenile, perhaps 4 feet tall, staying close to one of the larger individuals. The group gathered in the central area, and Maya watched in stunned silence as they engaged in what could only be described as conversation. The vocalizations were complex, combining guttural consonants with whistled tones, hands gesturing in patterns that reinforced or modified the sounds. Language. They were witnessing language. Marcus had his recording equipment running, capturing everything. "Acoustic analysis is going to go crazy with this," he whispered. "The frequency range extends beyond human vocal capability, but the structure, there are repeated phonemes, syntax patterns. This is symbolic communication." The juvenile broke away from the group, approaching what looked like a collection of river stones arranged in deliberate patterns. It crouched, manipulating the stones with clear intent, rearranging them into different configurations. One of the adults watched, occasionally reaching out to adjust the positioning, as if correcting or teaching. "They're counting," Maya said softly, recognition flooding through her. "Or doing some form of mathematical reasoning. That's educational behavior, cultural transmission of knowledge." The eastern sky was beginning to grey with approaching dawn. The group below seemed aware of this, their movements becoming more purposeful. They began covering the central fire pit with earth, dismantling or concealing anything that might indicate recent activity. The efficiency spoke to long practice. This was their standard protocol, executed before each day's light exposed them to potential observation. Maya's mind reeled with implications. These beings weren't simply intelligent animals. They possessed culture, language, architecture, and clear awareness of the need for concealment from human detection. They had lived alongside human civilization, possibly for thousands of years, successfully avoiding discovery through behavioral adaptation and careful habitat selection. The evolutionary implications alone were staggering. The last common ancestor humans shared with any living great ape existed roughly 6 to 7 million years ago. If these beings represented a separate lineage within the hominin radiation, perhaps a sister species to Homo sapiens, or a descendant of an earlier hominin migration to North America, the entire framework of human evolution would require revision. But there was something more immediate that troubled Maya. The juvenile that had been manipulating stones suddenly froze, its head turning in their direction. For a long moment, it stared directly at their hiding place, though they were concealed behind a screen of salal and huckleberry brush. One of the adults followed the juvenile's gaze. It made a sharp, urgent vocalization, and the entire group moved with astonishing speed. Within seconds, they had vanished into the dwellings or melted into the forest shadows, leaving no trace of their presence except the carefully concealed fire pit. "They knew we were here," Marcus said, his voice tight with apprehension. "The whole time they knew." Maya's pulse hammered. The implications were clear. These beings were acutely aware of human presence and had developed sophisticated counter-surveillance behaviors. They had allowed the researchers to observe, perhaps assessing the threat level, before withdrawing when they deemed it necessary. The question that burned in Maya's mind was simpler and far more immediate. What happened now? They had documented evidence of a surviving hominin species, living in small refugee populations within protected wilderness. The scientific discovery of the century, perhaps the millennium. But revelation meant exposure, and exposure meant destruction of the very thing that had allowed these beings to survive: secrecy. "We need to get closer," Maya decided. "Document the site properly, collect environmental DNA samples from the soil and structures. We need irrefutable evidence before we decide what to do with this information." They descended carefully into the amphitheater, approaching the nearest dwelling with scientific caution and acute awareness that they might be watched from the surrounding forest. The structure was even more sophisticated up close. The framework incorporated living tree roots woven together with stripped bark cordage to create load-bearing supports. The entrance was angled downward, designed to trap heat and prevent weather infiltration. Maya collected soil samples from the entranceway. Careful not to disturb the structure itself, she also took swabs from the cordage and surfaces that might contain skin cells or hair. Environmental DNA analysis would provide definitive genetic evidence, potentially revealing the evolutionary relationship between these beings and known hominin species. In the central area, she photographed the stone arrangements the juvenile had been manipulating. The patterns showed clear intentionality. Groupings of 3, 5, and 7 stones, arranged in ways that suggested numerical cognition. Beside the fire pit, she found fragments of worked wood, showing cut marks too deliberate and precise to be natural wear. "Maya!" Marcus's voice carried a sharp edge of alarm. "You need to see this." He was kneeling beside one of the larger dwellings, examining the ground beside the entrance. Maya joined him and saw immediately what had captured his attention. Blood, fresh blood, dark against the disturbed soil, leading into the dwelling's interior. Her medical training kicked in automatically. "Someone's injured. We should leave," Marcus said urgently. "We're intruding on their home. If one of them is hurt, they might die without intervention." Maya was already pulling out her medical kit, her hands moving on automatic pilot through years of wilderness first responder training. "I took an oath, Marcus. That oath doesn't specify species." She approached the entrance, moving slowly, speaking in a calm, steady voice, even though she had no idea if her words would be understood. "My name is Maya. I'm a doctor, a healer. If someone is hurt, I can help. Please, let me help." The darkness of the dwelling entrance revealed nothing. For long seconds, there was only silence and the soft patter of rain on the forest canopy above. Then, from within the structure, came a low sound. Pain, unmistakable in its quality. The sound any intelligent being makes when suffering exceeds the ability to remain silent. Maya moved to the entrance, shining her red LED light into the interior. The space was larger than expected, extending back and down into the earth, lined with woven mats and showing evidence of careful maintenance. In the far corner, pressed against the earthen wall, was the juvenile they'd seen earlier. She, the secondary sex characteristics were subtly visible, was holding her left arm cradled against her body. Even in the dim light, Maya could see the unnatural angle of the forearm. Compound fracture, possibly with arterial involvement given the amount of blood loss. The juvenile's eyes met Maya's, large, dark, unmistakably aware. In that gaze, Maya saw fear and pain, but also something else. Recognition, perhaps. The acknowledgement that this strange, pale being entering her home might be capable of rendering aid. "I'm going to come closer," Maya said softly, keeping her movements slow and deliberate. "I'm going to look at your arm. I'll be as gentle as I can." She crawled into the dwelling, acutely aware that this action violated every protocol of wildlife observation. Marcus remained outside, his presence a silent watch, ready to intervene or call for emergency extraction if needed. The juvenile didn't retreat as Maya approached. Instead, she slowly extended her injured arm, a gesture of trust so profound that Maya felt tears prick her eyes. She began her examination with careful hands, assessing the damage with practiced efficiency. Radius and ulna both fractured, the radius showing a partial break through the skin. Significant bleeding, but the radial pulse was still present. The artery was intact. The juvenile endured the examination with remarkable stoicism, occasionally making soft vocalizations that might have been communication with others outside or simply pain responses. "I'm going to stabilize this," Maya explained, mostly for her own benefit. "It's going to hurt when I set the bone, but then it will feel better. I promise." She prepared a field splint, using the rigid materials from her kit, along with padding to protect the skin. Setting the bone would be crucial. She needed to align the fractures properly to prevent long-term complications. The juvenile watched her preparations with intense focus, those dark eyes tracking every movement. Maya positioned her hands carefully. "Deep breath," she said. then performed the reduction with firm, controlled movement. The juvenile made a sharp cry, not animal, not quite human, but expressing agony in a universal language. The sound brought immediate response from outside. A large form appeared at the entrance, blocking the light, accompanied by a deep vocalization that carried undeniable threat. "It's okay," Maya said quickly, keeping her hands visible and non-threatening. "I'm helping. Look." She gestured to the splintered arm, now properly aligned and secured. The bleeding had stopped, controlled by pressure bandaging. The adult, clearly the juvenile's parent, entered the dwelling with surprising grace despite its size. It moved directly to the young one, examining the splintered arm with obvious intelligence. Long fingers, remarkably human-like despite their size, traced the edges of the bandaging, testing the security of the splint without disturbing it. Then those fingers moved to the juvenile's face, touching gently, checking for additional injuries. The young one made soft vocalizations, apparently reassuring, and gestured toward Maya. The adult turned its attention fully to Maya for the first time. They were perhaps 8 feet apart in the confined space, close enough that she could see the fine details of its face. The features were striking, clearly adapted for powerful mastication with robust jaw musculature, but the frontal skull was expanded, the eyes positioned for good binocular vision. The nasal aperture was broad, likely an adaptation for humidifying and warming the cool, moisture-laden air of the temperate rainforest. This was no Gigantopithecus, no extinct Asian ape. The morphology was distinctly hominin, this being shared recent common ancestry with Homo sapiens, perhaps a surviving population of Homo heidelbergensis, or something more surprising still, a separate lineage that had diverged before or during the initial human expansion into the Americas. The adult made a decision. It reached toward Maya, and she forced herself to remain still, though every instinct screamed to retreat. The large hand touched her shoulder gently, then moved to her face, fingertips brushing her cheek and forehead with remarkable delicacy. It was examining her, she realized, learning about human morphology through touch, just as she had examined its offspring. The gesture was one of mutual exploration, a recognition of kinship across species boundaries. When the examination was complete, the adult made a complex series of vocalizations while gesturing, first to Maya, then to the juvenile, then to the entrance. The meaning was clear even without shared language. "Thank you, but you must leave now." Maya nodded slowly. "I understand, but the arm needs care. The bandaging should be changed every day for a week. Clean water," she mimed, washing. "No infection." She pulled out her remaining bandages and antibiotics, leaving them carefully arranged where the adult could see. She demonstrated opening the antibiotic tube, applying a small amount to her own hand, then pointed to the juvenile's arm and held up fingers, once per day. The adult watched intently, then mimicked her gestures back to her, testing comprehension, or perhaps indicating understanding. The intelligence in those eyes was unmistakable. This being could learn, could understand cause and effect, could make connections between demonstration and application. Maya retreated slowly, backing out of the dwelling. Marcus stood waiting, his expression somewhere between awe and terror. Together, they climbed back up the ridge, neither speaking until they were well away from the site. When they finally paused to rest, Marcus turned to her with wide eyes. "What have we found, Maya? What are they?" "Family," Maya said quietly, the word carrying weight she was only beginning to understand. "They're family, distant cousins maybe, but family nonetheless. We have to report this. The genetic evidence alone. We report this, and within 6 months this valley will be swarming with researchers, tourists, and every crackpot with a camera phone," Maya interrupted. "Their survival depends on secrecy. They've maintained that secrecy for thousands of years, possibly tens of thousands. We have no right to destroy that. But the scientific implications, don't you see? The scientific implications include a moral dimension we can't ignore." Maya's voice was fierce with sudden conviction. These are people, Marcus. Cognition, culture, language, tool use, architecture, family bonds, everything that defines personhood. They're not specimens to be studied. They're a sovereign people with the right to exist unmolested. Marcus was silent for a long moment. So, what do we do? It was the question that would define everything that followed. Maya looked back toward the hidden valley, where a family of beings that shouldn't exist carried on their lives in determined secrecy. She thought of the juvenile's trusting gesture, extending her broken arm. The parent's gentle examination of her own face, seeking to understand the strange creature that had rendered aid. "We protect them," she said finally. "We document enough to be believed by the few who need to know, and then we become their guardians. Without consent, without contact unless absolutely necessary, we make sure their habitat remains protected, that no development or exploitation ever reaches this valley." That's a huge responsibility. Yes, Maya agreed. But it's the right one, the ethical one. As dawn fully broke over the Olympic Peninsula, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, the two researchers began the long hike back to civilization, carrying with them the burden of impossible knowledge and the weight of an oath that transcended species boundaries. The environmental DNA results came back 3 weeks later, and Maya read them alone in her university office, door locked, hands trembling as the implications crystallized into scientific certainty. The genetic analysis told a story that rewrote human evolutionary history. The sample contained mitochondrial DNA that diverged from the human lineage approximately 200,000 to 300,000 years ago, far more recently than any great ape, but well before the emergence of anatomically modern Homo sapiens. The nuclear DNA showed clear evidence of hominin origin, with chromosome structure similar but not identical to humans. Most significantly, analysis of specific genetic markers suggested these beings possessed the FOXP2 gene variant associated with complex language capability, along with other neurological adaptations found in human lineages. They weren't apes. They weren't even an archaic human subspecies like Neanderthals or Denisovans. The evidence pointed to something more remarkable. A sister species within the genus Homo, one that had diverged during the Middle Pleistocene and survived barely into the modern era. Maya had sent samples to 3 different labs under false pretenses, claiming they were from possibly contaminated field samples needing verification. All 3 returned similar results, with notes about unusual genetic markers that didn't quite match any reference database. One lab technician had flagged it as potential contamination between bear and human DNA, unable to conceive that the results might represent a real organism. She had exactly what she needed, irrefutable scientific proof, and she would never publish it. The ethical calculation was stark. Publication would mean fame, certainly, revolutionary discoveries, likely a Nobel Prize in time. It would also mean the end of everything that had allowed these beings to survive. Within months, every square mile of their habitat would be under surveillance. Well-meaning researchers and malicious exploiters alike would descend, and no amount of legal protection could preserve the secrecy that was their primary defense. Maya had spent the intervening weeks researching everything she could find about alleged Bigfoot encounters, reading through decades of reports with new eyes. The pattern was clear once you knew what to look for. A small population, perhaps only a few hundred individuals total, distributed through the most remote pockets of North American wilderness. They were intelligent enough to avoid cameras, to recognize the threat posed by human technology, to maintain cultural knowledge about evasion and concealment. They were also declining. Genetic analysis suggested a severe population bottleneck, low diversity, indicating that the population had crashed to very small numbers at some point, possibly multiple times. Each individual was precious, genetically irreplaceable in a very real sense. Habitat loss, human expansion, climate change, all the pressures that threatened countless other species bore down on beings who could think, who could choose, who could understand what was happening to them. The phone on her desk rang, displaying Marcus's number. "The juvenile," he said without preamble. "She's back at the site. I picked her up on thermal imaging this morning. The arm looks like it's healing well. She's using it anyway." "That's good news. There's more. I think they've been watching us. The monitoring station. I found these outside the equipment shed this morning." "Found what?" "Stones, arranged in patterns. Same kind of groupings we saw at the site." "Numbers, Maya. They're using stones to communicate numbers to us." Maya sat forward, pulse quickening. "Can you send me images?" Her computer pinged with incoming files. The photographs showed a cleared patch of ground outside their monitoring station, and arranged on it were river stones in deliberate groupings. 3 groups, 5 stones, then 7, then 12. The Fibonacci sequence. They were demonstrating mathematical knowledge, proving their intelligence in a way that transcended language barriers. "They're reaching out," Marcus said quietly, "initiating contact on their terms." It was the opportunity Maya had been hoping for and dreading in equal measure. Direct communication meant the possibility of establishing mutual understanding, protocols for coexistence. It also meant crossing a line that, once traversed, could never be uncrossed. "I'm coming up," she decided. "Tonight. We need to be there if they try again." She drove through the autumn darkness, the Land Cruiser's headlights cutting tunnels through rain and mist. The forests of the Olympic Peninsula felt different now, alive with hidden presence. How many times had they been observed without knowing it? How many of those feelings of being watched that wilderness travelers reported were actually accurate perceptions? Marcus met her at the research station, his face drawn with exhaustion and excitement. "I've been documenting everything. They came back twice more today, each time new patterns. Look." He pulled up photographs on his laptop. The stone arrangements had become more complex, geometric shapes, including what appeared to be a deliberate representation of the monitoring station itself, with the positions of buildings and equipment indicated by different-sized stones. In one corner, a group of 5 large stones, representing the beings themselves, were positioned at the edge of the forest, the boundary between their world and human technology. "This is a map," Maya breathed. "They're showing us their understanding of this place, their relationship to our presence here. There's something else." Marcus zoomed in on one section of the photograph. "These smaller stones. See how they're arranged? That's the constellation Ursa Major, the Big Dipper. They're demonstrating astronomical knowledge." The implications were staggering. These beings possessed not only mathematical and spatial reasoning, but also long-term celestial observation, the kind of knowledge that required cultural transmission across generations and the cognitive capability to recognize patterns in the night sky. They spent the night in the station, monitoring equipment trained on the cleared area where the stone communications appeared. Around 2 a.m., motion sensors triggered. Maya and Marcus watched the thermal feed as 3 large figures approached from the forest edge, moving with cautious deliberation. The juvenile was among them, flanked by 2 adults. Her injured arm hung more naturally now, the splint long removed, though the gait suggested some remaining stiffness. The 3 beings paused at the edge of the clearing, as if testing whether this proximity to human habitation was safe. Maya made a decision. She stepped outside, moving slowly, hands clearly visible. Marcus followed, carrying the tablet displaying previous stone arrangements. The beings didn't flee. Instead, they waited, watching with obvious alertness. In the glow of the station's external lights, Maya could see them more clearly than ever before. Their bodies were adapted for cold, wet environments, dense hair that would shed water, robust builds that conserved heat, large hands and feet that would distribute weight on soft forest floors. But it was their faces that captured her attention. Expressive, mobile, capable of conveying emotion. The juvenile looked at her with clear recognition, and Maya could have sworn she saw something like a smile, or the equivalent expression in their facial repertoire. She knelt slowly, picking up a river stone from the supplies they kept for watershed sampling. Deliberately, carefully, she placed it on the ground, then another beside it, then a third, creating a group of 3. The message was simple. I understand. I see what you're showing me. One of the adults, the one she thought of as the parent, though gender was still difficult to determine with certainty, moved forward. It approached to within 10 feet, closer than any wild animal would tolerate, certainly closer than any other primate, except humans would willingly come to a potential threat. The being gestured to itself, then made a complex vocalization. It repeated the gesture and sound 3 times, clearly attempting to communicate something specific. Then it pointed to Maya and tilted its head in an unmistakable question. "Maya," she said, touching her own chest. "My name is Maya." The being tried to reproduce the sounds, its vocal anatomy not quite capable of human phonemes, but managing a close approximation. Maya. It pointed to itself again and repeated its vocalization, a deep, resonant sound with tonal qualities, something like ka with additional harmonics. They were exchanging names. Ka, Maya repeated carefully, trying to match the tonal pattern. The being's facial expression shifted. Pleasure? Approval? It was impossible to be certain, but the response was clearly positive. The juvenile came forward then, emboldened by the successful exchange. She touched her own chest and made a higher-pitched vocalization, complex and musical. Then she extended her formerly injured arm, touching the area where the splint had been, and looked directly at Maya. Gratitude. The gesture was expressing gratitude for aid rendered. Maya felt tears blur her vision. "You're welcome," she said softly. "I'm glad I could help." For the next hour, they engaged in careful communication. The beings showed remarkable aptitude for understanding human gestures, while Maya and Marcus worked to learn the basics of their communication system. It became clear that their language relied heavily on tonal variation and combined vocalizations with manual gestures, a modality that made sense for a species living in dense forest where visual signals might be obscured. Omkar used the stones to demonstrate counting again, but this time went further. After arranging groups, the being collected specific numbers of stones and placed them in Maya's hand, then gestured expectantly. It took several attempts before Maya understood. Omkar wanted her to create her own groupings to demonstrate human mathematical reasoning. Maya arranged stones in geometric patterns, squares, triangles, circles. Omkar studied them intently, then created variations, transforming her square into a cube representation using 3-dimensional stone placement. The being understood geometry not just in 2 dimensions, but 3. Marcus, filming everything, whispered, "This is incredible. They're not just intelligent, they're engaging in abstract mathematical communication. Do you realize what this means?" Maya did realize. It meant these beings possessed cognitive capabilities essentially equivalent to humans, expressed through different cultural frameworks and adapted to different environmental pressures, but fundamentally similar in capacity for abstraction, symbolism, and reason. As dawn approached, Omkar made a gesture that seemed to indicate conclusion. But before leaving, the being did something unexpected. It reached into a woven pouch carried over one shoulder, tool use, another marker of sophisticated cognition, and withdrew a flat piece of wood, approximately 8 inches square. The wood's surface was covered in markings, carved symbols, pictographic representations, and patterns that might have been writing or might have been decorative art, or both. Omkar held it carefully, clearly indicating its importance, then pointed to specific symbols while making corresponding vocalizations. "It's a teaching device," Maya realized, "or a memory aid. Maybe both. They use these to transmit information." Omkar placed the carved wood on the ground between them, then gestured to Maya and back to the forest. The meaning took a moment to pass. This was a gift, but also a responsibility. The being was entrusting them with something culturally significant, perhaps as a symbol of the contact being established. Maya bowed her head in acknowledgement, a gesture of respect that seemed to transcend cultural boundaries. When she looked up, Omkar was making another gesture, hands together, then slowly separating while maintaining the same orientation. Stay apart, but connected. I understand, Maya said. We'll remain separate, but we'll remember. We'll help protect your home. The three beings withdrew into the forest as full dawn broke, vanishing into the understory with the practiced ease of lifelong concealment. Maya carefully lifted the carved wood, examining it in the growing light. The symbols were intricate, showing different levels of skill, some carved with precise control, others more hesitant, possibly the work of younger learners. This was their history, she realized, their way of preserving knowledge across generations in the absence of written language as humans practiced it. The pictographs showed hunting scenes, what might be family groupings, and symbols that could represent seasonal changes or celestial events. We need to make a record of this, Marcus said. High-resolution scans, linguistic analysis. Private record, Maya corrected firmly. Everything we document stays sealed. Academic publication would be a death sentence for them. Then what's the point? We have evidence of a surviving hominin species, Maya. This changes everything about human evolution, about intelligence, about our place in the natural world. How can we justify keeping that secret? It was the argument Maya had been having with herself for weeks. The scientist in her wanted to share this discovery, to revolutionize understanding of human origins and evolution. But the ethicist, and simply the human being who had looked into Omkar's eyes and seen a person looking back, knew that some knowledge carried too high a cost. We justify it because revealing them would destroy them, she said. Not intentionally, maybe, but the result would be the same. They'd become specimens, curiosities, tourist attractions. Even with the best intentions, with legal protections and wildlife reserves, they'd lose the one thing that's kept them alive for millennia, the ability to vanish. So we just watch, document privately and do nothing? No, we do something very specific. Maya's voice firmed with conviction. We become advocates for habitat protection without ever explaining why. We push for expanded wilderness preserves, for restrictions on development and resource extraction. We make sure the places they need to survive remain inviolate, and we establish a protocol, a network of researchers who know, who can monitor and protect without exposing. That's a massive undertaking. It would require resources, institutional support. I know, but it's the only ethical path forward. Maya carefully wrapped the carved wood in protective cloth. They're people, Marcus. They have the right to exist on their own terms, to maintain their culture and their secrecy. Our responsibility is to honor that right, not to violate it for human benefit, even scientific benefit. Over the following months, a careful system emerged. Maya established contact with 3 other researchers, a geneticist she trusted implicitly, a linguistic anthropologist with expertise in endangered languages, and a conservation biologist with experience in anti-poaching operations. She shared enough information to convey the stakes without providing location data or compromising imagery. The response was unanimous: protect at all costs. They created what they called the Silent Protocol, guidelines for observation and aid that prioritize the being's autonomy and safety. No direct contact unless initiated by the beings themselves. No publication of data that could lead to location identification. Maximum efforts toward habitat protection through legal and political channels. Maya continued to visit the Olympic site regularly, always respectful of boundaries. The stone communications appeared sporadically, usually mathematical or astronomical demonstrations, occasionally what seemed to be questions about human culture or requests for specific types of aid. Once, after a particularly harsh winter, Omkar arranged stones in a pattern that clearly represented food shortage, and Maya carefully left supplies of high-calorie, non-perishable foods at the forest edge. The juvenile healed completely, her arm showing no lasting damage. Maya observed her several more times over the next year, watching her grow and develop. Once, she saw the young one teaching an even younger individual, perhaps a sibling, the stone arrangement techniques, passing on the communication method that had proven effective in bridging the species gap. This was culture in its purest form, learned behaviors transmitted across generations, adapted to new circumstances, allowing survival through flexibility rather than genetic hardwiring alone. But as Maya's understanding deepened, so did her anxiety. She began compiling reports of historical encounters, mapping them against habitat loss over the past century. The pattern was stark: populations declining, ranges fragmenting, genetic isolation increasing. The beings were trapped in an evolutionary cul-de-sac, too intelligent to expand into human-dominated landscapes, too few in number to maintain genetic diversity, too dependent on pristine wilderness that shrank yearly. She was looking at extinction in real time, slowed but not stopped by their intelligence and adaptability. The carved wood became a focus of her private research. Working with the linguistic anthropologist through carefully anonymized channels, they analyzed the symbols and patterns. What emerged was evidence of a sophisticated symbol system that combined pictographic representation with abstract markers. Not quite writing as humans practiced it, but something analogous, serving similar functions of information storage and transmission. One section of the carving appeared to be genealogical, family relationships spanning what might be multiple generations. Another showed seasonal movements, suggesting these beings maintained detailed knowledge of their territory and resource availability across annual cycles. A third section was more puzzling: symbols that might represent numbers or quantities, but in combinations that didn't immediately make sense. It was Marcus who finally deciphered it. "Their population counts," he said, his voice hollow. "Look, this symbol here appears in multiple contexts, always associated with individual representations. It's counting people. And Maya, the numbers are tiny. Based on this, their entire population might be fewer than 300 individuals, and declining. 300. For a species with sophisticated culture, language, and intelligence comparable to humans. 300 individuals facing habitat loss, climate change, and the random genetic drift that imperiled any small population. They were watching a people die. The knowledge was crushing. Maya found herself waking at night, thinking about Omkar and the juvenile, and all the others hidden in remote valleys and ancient forests. She thought about their culture, their knowledge, their songs, if they had songs, and the fact that all of it would vanish without trace unless something changed. But what could change? Revealing them might provide short-term protection, but would destroy their culture and quite possibly accelerate their decline through the stress of constant human presence. Remaining silent preserved their dignity and autonomy, but offered no solution to the fundamental problem of insufficient habitat and declining numbers. The dilemma kept her awake, haunted her waking hours, drove her to ever more creative efforts to expand wilderness protection without explaining why. She testified before congressional committees on the importance of old-growth forest preservation. She wrote grants for expanded wildlife corridors. She mobilized public opinion against development projects in key habitats, and through it all, she carried the weight of impossible knowledge that humanity's closest relatives, the beings who might teach us so much about ourselves and our evolutionary heritage, were slipping toward extinction while the world remained oblivious to their existence. The carved wood sat in her locked office drawer, a tangible reminder of trust given and responsibility accepted. Sometimes she would take it out, tracing the carved symbols, trying to imagine the hands that had made them and the thoughts behind their creation. They were not so different, really. The same capacity for love and family, for learning and teaching, for understanding their place in a vast and complex world. The same vulnerability to forces beyond individual control, the same need for space and security to raise their young and transmit their culture, the same right to exist. The first indication of disaster came in February, during the coldest week the Olympic Peninsula had experienced in a generation. Maya was teaching a seminar on conservation ethics when her phone vibrated with an emergency message from Marcus. Thermal activity absent at primary site for 48+ hours. No movement detected. Need immediate response. She left her students mid-sentence, driving through ice-slicked roads with her heart hammering against her ribs. Absent thermal activity in winter could mean the beings had simply moved to a more sheltered location. They were known to maintain multiple camps within their territory. But 2 days without any sign, combined with dangerous cold and deep snow accumulation, suggested something more serious. Marcus met her at the trailhead with snowshoes and grim determination. The forest was transformed by winter, rendered alien by 3 feet of snow, and temperatures hovering near 0 Fahrenheit. This was weather that killed. Even for beings adapted to Pacific Northwest winters, prolonged exposure to this level of cold could be fatal. They reached the primary site just before dusk, and Maya's worst fears materialized into terrible reality. The semi-subterranean dwellings showed signs of hasty abandonment. The carefully maintained entrances were left open, exposing the interiors to cold and snow. More troubling still were the tracks. Multiple individuals had moved through recently, but the gait patterns showed distress, stumbling, inconsistent step length, the signs of hypothermia or exhaustion. They evacuated, Marcus said, reading the signs with practiced expertise. Something went wrong. Maybe food shortage, maybe cold penetrated their dwellings. Track them, Maya interrupted. We need to find them. Tonight, if possible. They followed the trail as darkness fell and temperatures dropped further. The tracks led northwest, deeper into the most remote section of the national park, into terrain so rugged that even experienced mountaineers avoided it in winter. Maya pushed forward, driven by desperate urgency. Hypothermia was insidious. Once core temperature dropped below critical levels, the victims often made irrational decisions, wandering aimlessly or stopping to rest in locations that became their graves. The tracks grew more erratic, showing clear evidence of deteriorating coordination. Maya recognized the pattern. She'd seen it in human hypothermia cases during her medical training. They were running out of time. Marcus's headlamp caught something ahead, a dark shape against the snow, too large to be a fallen log. They approached rapidly, and Maya dropped to her knees beside a huddled form. It was one of the younger adults, possibly a female based on body size and proportions. She was semi-conscious, curled in a ball, her breathing shallow and rapid. Advanced hypothermia, possibly stage 3. Life-threatening, potentially fatal without immediate intervention. Maya didn't hesitate. She stripped off her own insulated jacket and wrapped it around the being, then activated chemical heat packs from her emergency kit and placed them against the victim's core, chest, abdomen, armpits. Marcus, emergency beacon. We need helicopter extraction. Maya, we can't. If we call for extraction, they'll see a large unidentified primate, and by the time anyone figures out what they're really looking at, we'll have moved her to a secure location. Maya was already on her satellite phone, dialing the Park Service emergency line. This is Dr. Maya Chen, Olympic Research Station. I have a critical hypothermia case at... She rattled off GPS coordinates, requesting immediate helicopter extraction to nearest medical facility. The operator confirmed, estimating 40 minutes for helicopter arrival given weather conditions. Maya worked frantically, doing everything her training permitted to stabilize the patient. She established an airway, monitored breathing, used all her remaining heat packs to warm the core temperature gradually. Too fast could cause cardiac arrest, too slow meant brain damage and death. There are more tracks continuing northwest, Marcus reported. At least 3 more individuals, maybe 4. Follow them, find them. I'll stay with this one until extraction arrives, then I'll join you. Marcus hesitated only a moment, then vanished into the snowy darkness, following the desperate trail. The 40 minutes until helicopter arrival felt endless. Maya maintained continuous monitoring, talking to her patient in a steady stream of reassurance, even though understanding was unlikely in the being's current state of consciousness. She thought about Omka, about the juvenile with the broken arm, wondering if they were among those still moving through the lethal cold. The helicopter appeared as a roaring presence of noise and light. Maya had positioned herself to block direct view of her patient, and the harsh downwash of rotor-driven snow created additional visual confusion. The rescue team descended with professional efficiency. "Large primate, species uncertain," Maya shouted over the rotor noise, sticking as close to truth as possible. "Hypothermic, critical condition, needs immediate transport and warming." To their credit, the rescue team didn't waste time on questions. They secured the patient in a thermal blanket and litter, and within minutes, the helicopter was lifting away. Maya had agreed to meet them at the hospital after securing her research site, giving herself time to manage the situation before difficult questions began. She set off northwest at a run, following Marcus's trail illuminated by her powerful headlamp. The tracks continued for nearly a mile before she found Marcus crouched beside a natural rock shelter formed by fallen old-growth cedars. Inside the shelter were 4 beings, huddled together for warmth. Marcus had already deployed his emergency supplies, heat packs, thermal blankets, even the camp stove to provide ambient warmth. But the scene was desperate. 2 adults and 2 juveniles, all showing signs of severe hypothermia, trapped in a refuge that had become inadequate against the unprecedented cold. Maya recognized one of the juveniles immediately, the one she'd treated for the broken arm, now nearly grown. And one of the adults was Omka, barely conscious, but with eyes that still showed recognition when they found Maya's face. "I've been trying to warm them gradually," Marcus said, his voice tight with stress. "But we need more supplies, more heat, and Maya, look." He pointed to the snow outside the shelter, fresh tracks, canine large. Wolf pack, likely drawn by the scent of vulnerable prey. The Olympic Peninsula's wolf population was still recovering, still struggling to establish territories. A pack encountering weakened large animals would see opportunity, not kinship. "We need to move them," Maya decided. "Get them to the research station. It's 3 miles, but we have snow machines there. Can they travel?" They roused the beings as gently as possible, communicating through gesture and determination. Omka understood first and helped bring the others to alertness. The effort to stand was painful to watch. These powerful beings reduced to shivering weakness by environmental conditions that overwhelmed even their adaptations. Maya and Marcus positioned themselves at the front and rear of the group, urging them forward. The trek became a nightmarish struggle against cold, exhaustion, and failing strength. They stopped frequently to redistribute heat packs, to share emergency caloric supplements, to simply let everyone rest before pushing onward. Halfway through, they heard howls, the wolf pack, closer now, tracking their movement. The beings heard it too, and Maya saw fear in their expressions, a fear that transcended species. Wolves were ancient enemies, perhaps, or simply recognized as predators by beings whose ancestors had once been prey. "Keep moving," Maya urged. "Not far now, safe place ahead." Whether they understood her words or simply her intent, they pushed forward. The howls came again, closer still, and Maya caught glimpses of movement at the edge of her headlamp's reach. The pack was shadowing them, waiting for someone to fall behind, to become separated and vulnerable. Marcus pulled out an emergency flare, igniting it with a harsh chemical light that painted the snow in violent reds and greens. The wolves retreated from the unexpected brightness, buying them precious minutes. They used those minutes, covering the final mile in a stumbling rush that ended with arrival at the research station just as the flare guttered out. Inside, Maya cranked the heating system to maximum and began methodical treatment. 4 cases of moderate to severe hypothermia requiring gradual rewarming, constant monitoring, and careful attention to cardiac function. She worked through the night with Marcus's assistance, their patient care transcending species boundaries. Omka recovered first, strength returning with warmth and rest. The being watched Maya work with clear understanding, occasionally assisting, holding a juvenile still during examination, helping position heat sources, even learning to monitor breathing rates by mimicking Maya's technique. By dawn, all 4 patients had stabilized. They were weak, exhausted, but alive and recovering. Maya collapsed into a chair, her own exhaustion catching up with sudden, overwhelming force. Omka approached carefully, carrying something from the woven pouch that had somehow survived the desperate flight through the snow. It was another carved wood piece, smaller than the first, and the being placed it gently in Maya's hands. The carving showed 2 figures, one clearly meant to represent a being, the other smaller, bipedal but different, human. The 2 figures were touching hands, and between them was carved the symbol Maya had learned meant help or healing. Memory. This was creating memory, recording the event for future generations. The night that humans had saved lives, had crossed species boundaries to render aid when survival hung in question. "You're welcome," Maya whispered, too tired for tears. "Your family. We protect family." Over the next week, Maya managed an increasingly complex deception. The being she'd sent to the hospital was recorded as an unknown primate, possibly escaped exotic pet, and held under quarantine protocols. Maya, using her credentials and carefully constructed lies, arranged for transfer to a specialist facility that existed only on paper. In reality, she transported the recovering patient back to the Olympic site once she'd stabilized, reuniting her with the others who had sheltered at the research station. But the close call had revealed the fragility of their situation. Climate change was producing more frequent extreme weather events. The being's traditional territories were under increasing pressure from human recreational use, even within national parks. And the genetic bottleneck meant each individual lost was a catastrophic blow to species survival. Maya called an emergency meeting of her silent protocol network. 5 researchers now, scattered across the continent, each monitoring different populations of the beings in different wilderness areas. The reports were uniformly grim: declining numbers, fragmenting populations, increasing signs of stress, and reduced reproductive success. "We're watching extinction in real time," the conservation biologist stated flatly. "At current trajectories, they'll be functionally extinct, unable to maintain genetic diversity within 2 generations, completely extinct within 4. Then we need to change the trajectory," Maya said with fierce determination. "We need protected corridors, habitat expansion, possibly even managed genetic intervention if they'll consent to it. That requires revealing them," the geneticist pointed out, "or at least revealing enough to justify the measures you're proposing." It was the dilemma Maya had been wrestling with for years, now sharpened to crisis point. Silence meant watching them disappear. Revelation might save them, or might destroy them more quickly through the chaos of global attention and exploitation. "What if we revealed evidence without revealing location?" Maya proposed. "Genetic data, acoustic recordings, imagery that proves existence without showing where. Create public support for wilderness preservation on the grounds that there's something out there worth protecting without making them directly accessible." "That's a hell of a gamble," Marcus said. "Once evidence is public, the pressure to find them becomes enormous. You'll have every amateur cryptozoologist and conspiracy theorist flooding into potential habitats. And possibly legitimate protection efforts," the linguistic anthropologist countered. "Endangered Species Act listing, international conservation attention, funding for habitat preservation. The risks are real, but so are potential benefits." They debated through the night, weighing impossible choices. In the end, Maya made the decision that would define her legacy. They would prepare a controlled release of evidence, carefully curated to prove existence while obfuscating location. They would time it with a major push for wilderness preservation legislation, framing the being's survival as dependent on habitat protection rather than direct contact. It would be a gamble with the highest possible stakes. But silence had become its own form of extinction, the slow, inevitable death of a people who deserved the chance to survive. Before implementing the plan, Maya returned one final time to the Olympic site. She found Omkar there, along with the juvenile she'd first treated and several others from the family group. She carried with her a carefully prepared package, long-term food supplies, advanced first aid materials, and something more, a tablet device, ruggedized and simplified, loaded with images and videos that explained basic medical techniques, food preservation, and even showed human architectural techniques for cold weather shelter. It was a risk, introducing technology, but it was also respect, providing tools that might help them survive, trusting them to use those tools wisely. Omkar accepted the package with solemn attention, examining each item with clear interest. When the being activated the tablet and saw moving images, the expression of wonder was unmistakable. Here was new knowledge, new possibilities, delivered not as imposition but as gift between equals. Maya used the stones one final time, arranging them in a pattern that had become their shared language. She created groupings that meant, "I will help, I will protect, you will not be alone." Omkar responded with a pattern Maya had learned, meant understanding and agreement. Then the being added something new, a carefully arranged symbol that Maya had seen in the carved wood pieces, one that seemed to mean remember or memory. They were asking to be remembered, not discovered, not studied, not revealed, but remembered in whatever way humans could preserve memory without destroying its subject. "I promise," Maya said softly, "the world won't forget you. Even if they don't know you exist, their actions will protect you. Your children will have forests to live in, valleys to hide in. You'll survive." She couldn't know if it was a promise she could keep, but she would spend whatever remained of her life trying. 3 months later, a carefully curated release of evidence appeared in a top-tier scientific journal. Genetic data showing the existence of an unknown hominin species, accompanied by acoustic analyses of vocalizations that demonstrated linguistic complexity, and habitat mapping that showed potential range without revealing specific locations. The paper was authored by a consortium of researchers and framed carefully around conservation ethics and the species' right to privacy. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Scientific community divided between excited acceptance and skeptical denial. Media explosion of interest, speculation, and controversy. Government agencies scrambling to assess implications for land management and endangered species protection. And in the wilderness, in hidden valleys and remote forests, a small population of beings continued their lives largely unchanged. They watched the humans through secret eyes, perhaps understanding in their own way that something had shifted, that their existence had been acknowledged without being exposed. Maya watched it all from her office, monitoring news coverage and scientific responses, ready to intervene if interest grew too focused, too localized. The linguistic anthropologist fed disinformation into online cryptozoology communities, creating false trails and red herrings that distributed searches across the continent rather than concentrating them in actual habitats. The geneticist worked with conservation organizations to push for expanded wilderness protection, using the scientific evidence to justify habitat corridors and restricted access zones. The conservation biologist coordinated with sympathetic park rangers and wildlife managers to increase enforcement of backcountry regulations and reduce human presence in key areas. It was working. Slowly, imperfectly, but working. Public fascination translated into conservation funding. Wilderness protection bills that had languished in committee suddenly gained traction. The beings remained hidden, but the world that might preserve their hiding places was changing in their favor. Years later, Maya would return to the Olympic Peninsula and find stone arrangements at the research station, complex patterns that showed continued communication, continued trust. Sometimes she would glimpse figures at the forest edge, watching with those dark, intelligent eyes. The juvenile she'd first treated had grown to adulthood and appeared to have offspring of her own, spotted once on thermal imaging, a small figure clinging to a larger form, new life continuing the ancient lineage. The population remained small, remained vulnerable, but genetic analysis suggested a slight uptick in diversity, possibly multiple groups making contact, interbreeding, maintaining what vitality they could in their fragmented refuge. It wasn't salvation. It was simply survival, hard-won and uncertain, purchased with secrecy and sacrifice and the moral choice to value autonomy over knowledge. Maya kept her office drawer locked, the carved wood pieces safe inside, looked at only in private moments. They were memory made physical, the trust given by beings who had every reason to fear humanity, but chose instead to reach out, to share symbols and knowledge, to bridge the gap between kindred species. On quiet nights, she would trace the carved symbols and think about Umka, about the juvenile with the broken arm, about all those others living their hidden lives in the deep forests. She would think about the promises made and the responsibilities accepted, and she would remember. She would remember for all those who could never know, carrying the weight of impossible knowledge and the burden of necessary silence, because some truths were too precious to speak aloud and some peoples too valuable to expose to the destroying light of public revelation. Their survival depended on staying hidden, staying silent, staying safe. And Maya, along with her small network of guardian researchers, would make certain that silence remained unbroken. In the end, that was love. Not possession, not study, not fame or recognition. Just the quiet, determined protection of beings who deserve to exist on their own terms, hidden but not forgotten, secret but not alone. The forest kept its mysteries, and humanity, unknowing, kept the forest safe. For now, that was enough. If this story moved you, stirred your imagination, or made you think differently about our place in the natural world, please consider supporting our channel. Subscribe for more speculative fiction that blends scientific rigor with emotional depth, exploring the boundaries between human and non-human intelligence. Share this story with others who appreciate narratives that challenge our assumptions and expand our circle of moral consideration. Your engagement helps us continue creating stories that matter, tales that don't just entertain, but invite us to see the world and our responsibilities within it with new eyes. Thank you for reading, for caring, and for remembering that some of the most important stories are those that ask us to protect rather than to exploit, to preserve rather than to possess.